a little nervous of the social media mob.
Do you think there's a problem with communication today between economists and academia to the layperson?
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think are the big causes of that?
Well, I mean, I think number one, it's the business model of media, right? The negative headlines have become, there's a chart showing like how headline sentiment has decreased. Like there's just straightward down over time. And negative headlines have a 2.6% click-through rate, I think. And then if you have a positive headline, the click-through rate decreases by 1.9%. So like that right there is an issue. Like people want to click on negative news. And so I think that
Decreases, I'm so sorry, decreases by 1.9% or 1.9 points from does it go down like below 1% click-through or?
it decreases by 1.9%. Yeah, so people click on it less.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But do they click on it 1.9% less than 2.6 click-through rate?
It's two separate statistics, yeah.
Okay.
Gotcha. Okay.
So from a baseline, right? And so I think that's like part of the issue. And then academia is great. And like, I really enjoy reading research papers, but like there's so much research being produced. And oftentimes it's like just, they're writing to a journal, like they're writing to fellow academics, which is fine. But yeah, I mean, I was actually talking about this with Marshall, who runs the Realignment podcast this morning, because we were talking about sort of this communication failure. And I think that's part of the sort of situation that we're in right now, is that all these things are happening around everybody, right? Like you're looking at politics, you're looking at the economy, you're looking at everything that's going on, and then you go and read the headlines and it's completely confusing. It's, sometimes misleading. And so, yeah, that's a long way to say I do think that there's a communication failure.
I'm super curious, because one thing coming from like my background in school, I remember a lot of professors that I talked to about like getting back online and just debunking lots of like bad information, is that they're extremely fearful of the social media like monster as well. They look at a professor becoming more public, getting a ton of like hate, and then it like disrupting their career in some way, even if it's not like as extreme as like the examples that are coming to mind immediately. Most academics are very, very nervous of kind of that mob emailing their job and messaging them, because the university probably won't protect them, I think is a really common sentiment I hear.
Yeah, and so you're saying that's like why they wouldn't enter public
Have
discourse?
you noticed that's the same in economics as well? Like, is that, because I'm from psychology, right? Sure. So is that the same feeling? Is there economists that are very nervous of the social media mob, or is that not so much an issue in it?
I mean, I think everybody's a little nervous of the social media mob. There was actually an interesting chart that was published the other day of like the top economists that get cited. Jason Furman out of Harvard is like, number one, and he's extremely active on Twitter. Isabella Weber is another one, extremely active on Twitter. And so I think like the poll is that you have to post on social media for your research to really be seen by people. But yeah, I mean, there's always worry about who is going to read it and how are they not going to read it, and like what kind of questions are they going to ask. So I think the social media mob is like outside of, it just impacts everybody. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Honing in on the Vibecession. So it seems like for the past year and a half, economists have been like scouring every economic indicator possible to figure out like where is all of the negative consumer sentiment coming from. It feels like the majority between what I've seen in the Wall Street Post or Financial Times seems like they kind of center on it's just like politically oriented consumer sentiment. Other people are trying to hone in more on things like people point out like consumer savings rates or other like very like types of, I've seen like derivative things like rates of percentages of to try to like find where the consumer sentiment is. Do you think ultimately when a person has a feeling about the economy, about whether they're doing better or whether they're doing worse, right now it seems like the overall perception is that things are not good. Do you think that that's more tethered to financial reality, or do you think it's more tethered to like a political perception based on the news they consume?
So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because when I first published that piece, like I was like, oh gosh, like why are people feeling bad? Like look at GDP, look at the labor market, inflation is going down. And now I look back at that and I wish I had been just had done deeper research on some things, because like we have a structural affordability crisis, right? Like we have a housing crisis. Elder care is $10,000 a month. Childcare costs are up 32% since 2019. And so like there are real reasons that people feel bad. And so oftentimes the Vibecession will be taken out of context and people will be like, you just think people feel bad for no good reason. I think the Vibecession is more this idea that people feel far worse about the economy than they should, considering where we are. And the worry is that when the economy, if it does enter a recession, what will they feel then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how bad will consumer sentiment be then? And so it's really about like managing expectations and how do you sort of explain to people like what the circumstances are and like how much worse they could get. But then I think going back to the point about media, like a lot of it is media headline, right? A lot of it is the news that you're consuming. We're in a post-truth society, and that is alarming. And so, of course, people are going to feel bad about that as well.
I'm so curious, and again, assume that I like know nothing. Like
Sure.
I'm a layman when it comes to all this stuff. So the biggest gap that I hear as a layman as to that could explain to me why the economy is so strong, GDP is so good, as you said, inflation's growing slower than it has in quite a long time. Is that housing? I see a lot of people point to housing and that being like rent is like 50% of most people's income, or mortgage and utilities and stuff is 50% of the income. Is that the main thing? And is that even different from before? Because I don't actually know, like, was rent usually about 30 to 50% of people's income? Has the housing changed a lot? I know we have a housing crisis. Is it actually this major difference? Does that explain a lot of the fear, or?
Yeah. So rent used to be 3.5 times the median income, and now it's 4.5 times, or housing cost, 4.5 times the median income. And so the rule of thumb is that it should be no more than 1/3 of your income, but a lot of people are paying, as you said, 50%. That's like the expectation, is that you'll end up paying 50% of your income. And so during the pandemic, housing.
Can I ask on that? I'm honing in, being very particular. When you say with that number that you just referred to, does that refer to people paying mortgages or exclusively people renting?
It's a mix of both.
It's a mix of both? Okay, go on.
So mortgages are up and rent is up.
Yeah,
for
everything
people.
is up.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a Fred chart. I can like send it if
Sure.
it'd be
Okay.
useful. Yeah. But yeah, it's I think it's actually up to 4.6 the last time that I checked. And so, yeah, it's extremely expensive housing costs, and like they went up extraordinarily high during the pandemic. I think the San Francisco Federal Reserve said that had a study coming out that 24% of the increase in housing costs were due to work from home. So people moving into a home, they're like, I'm going to build my office here, I need more space. But then you also have demographic issues, right? Like there's tax incentives for boomers to stay in their homes. Boomers own more 4-bedroom and 3-bedroom homes and millennials do. And so you kind of have like this stagnation that's happening in the housing market. You also have people that, it's hard to build because interest rates are high. And so there's all of these different forces that are making it really difficult to build. And the main issue is just supply. And like people, and of course you could, move to the middle of Nebraska and afford a house, but
Excuse me.
but there aren't homes where people want to live, right? Like Miami is extremely expensive. Denver, Colorado, extremely expensive. New York City, and that's tough.
Do you think that'll change with more people like living at home though? Like increasingly, as long as internet is available in like the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, a lot of people can just live there. Or do you think like that it won't solve because people still want restaurants, they still want social culture around them?
Yeah. I mean, I think you did see people kind of move to the mountains in the middle of the pandemic, and you saw like all these ski towns in Colorado kind of get destroyed by that. But I think people want to live, if they can, in a metropolis. And as, remote work ends and work from the office becomes more popular, return to the office, people are going to have to be back in these cities. And so I think it's a really tough situation because it's a problem that is decades in the making, right? Like during the Great Recession, it was a housing bubble. So builders were like, we can't build. And that's been the issue for the past, decade, is that people don't want to build. And that's kind of how we've ended up where we are.
Okay, I've got 4 different things that I want to ask you about, okay, relating to economic crises, okay? So we've been talking about the housing crisis. Oftentimes people point out that we just need to build more. If we just zone for more housing, or if we have higher density housing. If you've been anywhere, I've lived in LA. I've lived in Miami. You'll have like high rises like this, and I'm sure you can see right down the street. There's like duplexes that have like they're 4 units. Do you think that supply can be like infinitely scaled in a way, I guess, like they do in Tokyo for Japan?
Yeah.
Do you think that's possible? Do you think it's unrealistic, and we should be looking for other solutions? Or
I think it's possible for sure. You know, it's either 70 or 90% of Los Angeles is zoned for single family zoning. And so like, it's really tough to build a high rise in LA, but like LA needs high rises, right? Because a lot of people want to live there and there's not a lot of places to live, and that drives the cost of housing up. But then there's all these different forces that come in with the housing market. And like one of them is NIMBYism. And so in California, Not in My Backyard is a very popular movement because housing is the main way to build wealth in the United States. So like, not only are we talking about a place to live, but we're also talking about a speculative asset that people are, planning their retirement around.
Yeah.
do you think on a finance level, I fight about this a lot on my stream. Do you think that that's a good method of building wealth?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why not?
I think there's a chart from the Federal Reserve. It's called the distribution of financial assets. And I think it's very telling because the bottom 50% have all of their wealth tied up into housing. But if you look at the top 10%, it's business ownership and equity ownership. So they own a business and they own stocks. And I think that is like the main way to build wealth, but it's a diversification. It's a way for people to have access to the stock market, which has higher returns than a house would. I don't know about business ownership, whether it's small business loans or employee stock option programs. But I think there has to be other alternatives because that's why you get NIMBYism. And it makes sense to me. Like, I get why people are like, don't build around me. I have to preserve the value of my home.
You're protecting your nest egg. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And so that's also, the tough part. It makes total sense. There's studies showing that building more doesn't reduce the value of the home. But people, for them, they're like, I've saved up my whole life. I have a home now, and you're going to say that you're going to build a high rise next to me. Don't do that.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense.
There's when you talk about any good or service, there's the propensity to overconsume it, and housing is one of those things that if you were to even utter the words, well, overconsumption of housing, people wouldn't understand it or would think that that's impossible or would get offended or upset. But I've heard a lot of horror stories around rent control, especially in places like New York City, where you get you'll have like a family of 5 and the kids grow up and they move out, and you've got mom and dad who are getting older, but why would they give up their amazing rent control property? Or if they own a large house, they're not going to sell their house and downsize. Why would they do that? So then you end up with, you're already zoning for single family homes, and now you've got these people, they don't have to pay a mortgage anymore, so they're not making monthly payments, and that you just have like 2 people sitting in these massive homes that are completely underutilized.
Yeah, just rattling around in there too.
Yeah. One of the things that's frustrating also, the reason why I asked you to differentiate when you gave that rental statistic earlier, I think I've seen Levine write about this. And there's a guy on Twitter called No Opinion.
Sure, yeah.
He writes a lot about, I think, housing related stuff too. People talk a lot about renters and renting. I've seen some people make the argument though that mortgage owners are in a massively good spot right now, and nobody really sees it or talks about it because of the fact that I think there's a larger amount of homeowners right now that have unfathomably low interest rates because of how many people refinanced over the past like low Federal Reserve rates than have ever before. And then the amount of wealth that's growing as houses are all appreciating, that this is like a class of people that are gaining a lot of wealth that people don't see. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, it's golden handcuffs, right?
Yeah.
Like these people, and it creates a bifurcation in the economy, and it's actually quite interesting because these people are tied in for 30 years, and there's actually speculation that all these mortgage owners that are locked in at 2 to 3% have made Federal Reserve policy less effective because they're not as impacted by high rates. They're like, we're locked in. If with an auto loan they'd be more impacted, or a consumer loan in general. But no, there's definitely a class of people who have massively benefited from the housing market being on the rise. Like from 2020 to 2021, the median home price went up more than the median worker makes, right? Like it just was a massive wealth gain if you were able to capture it. And so you have this bifurcation in the economy, those that got in and those that didn't. And that's within the millennial demographic. And then you're going to have further bifurcation from those that inherit homes from their boomer parents and then those that don't.
Yeah.
And so it's actually kind of like a wealth inequality issue.
And then it's also frustrating because, as a quick thing, when you say bifurcation, you're talking about basically the people that are separating more and more in class because they have access to some things and access to not some things. It's frustrating because when people complain sometimes about economic policy, they're asking for combinations of things that are inherently non-contradictory. So not to say if it would be a good policy or not, but a lot of people would say, I wish that we could forgive student loans because if they forgave student loans, I would be able to afford houses. And it feels like sometimes people don't have this understanding that, okay, well, what you want to do is you want to free up cash for people in order to afford houses that you can't afford. But by freeing up all that cash, you're putting massive upward prices on homes. Yeah. And people will hit these things at both ends constantly. People will complain about skyrocketing housing values, but then they'll say, well, why are interest rates going up? They need to go back down again so I can afford stuff. Yeah. And it's communicating that to people is very frustrating.
Yeah, no, it's extremely, it's hard because like the economy is such a personal experience. Like all of us have a personal inflation rate. All of us have a personal experience with the labor market. And then whenever you talk about the economy, you're talking in terms of averages and medians. And people are like, that's not my story. Like that doesn't resonate with me at all. And so it's extremely hard to discuss that.
Yeah. There is no American with 1.9 children. You know, like everybody, we don't live in averages.
How do you go about then? Because when I think about the economy, and maybe I'm super wrong, but when I think about the economy, I think of it like as somebody who's really bad at drawing.
Oh, you're super wrong. You always talk about the economy in squares. Never circles.
I like circles. Are circles okay? Economy? You don't mind if I use circles?
No, go
Why
for
would you
it.
use squares?
I don't know. Why would you use squares?
Circles are for psychology, but go ahead.
Really?
I'm just fucking with you.
I can't believe I believed you. That's embarrassing.
Oh,
Cut that
no,
out,
yeah, I was
August.
completely fucking with you.
Yeah.
It was a very authoritative tone.
Well, I didn't believe you until you kept going on. Anyways, okay. So what I view the economy is kind of like this, right? Like there's all these different, and say these are policies, right? And like different choices that are being made. So say like this is like student debt, this is like a mortgage or something. And if the government does something to maybe like wiggle this up,
Oh, sure, yeah.
it actually tugs all of these things around too.
Yeah.
So how do you go about explaining that? Because I think even though it's similar to how people live, I don't think most people think as holistically, especially when you're talking about social engineering of like, if you move this piece and make this policy, I know it sounds really good, like affirmative action or something, but it has all of these other ramifications that you probably didn't expect. Like, how do you in economy explain that to people of being like, well, this is why you probably should or shouldn't do these things?
Yeah. I mean, you do have to talk in terms of systems, but it's hard to visualize, right? Like circle, squares, whatever. It's hard. And so I think that oftentimes you are sort of stuck being like, well, we can't do this because like it creates more issues down the road. You know, the student loan debt and the housing is a really good example because that would be massively inflationary, right? Like it would exacerbate all the issues and people would be more upset. But there's a lot of short-term thinking about economic problems, even on a policymaking level. And so for people, they're like, but I have this immediate pain now. And it makes total sense. Like, they're like, I have this immediate pain now and I need it solved right now. But you just have to be like, well, you know, the doctor says that, you know, you have to take your medicine and you have to wait and you have to absorb these higher interest rates because hopefully they'll, you know, reduce inflation and then maybe, you know, you can afford a house. But in the tough part with, you know, the systems is that in a post-pandemic world, the economy is massively different. Like the models and the frameworks, like the Phillips curve, like basically doesn't work anymore. So
what's the Phillips curve?
The relationship between like wages and unemployment. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really work the way that people thought it would.
Wait, can you?
Yeah.
So one explanation I've heard for this, I don't know if this is hitting on the same thing, is the idea that, so the idea was that even though employment would change slightly, you would see these massive differences in median wages. But the way that people would do this is they would go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and they would break out the types of jobs that were coming in or out of the economy.
Yeah.
Because what happened was as the pandemic started to end and employment started to increase massively, you saw median wages drop a ton. And obviously people ran with this like, oh, look, like companies realized they can screw us over again. But what had happened was when you broke out the jobs, people that were working, you know, software engineers, everything, they made out dirty in the pandemic. It was insane. They were working from home, no cost of cars. They weren't spending as much eating out. They were saving tons of money. But people that were working jobs like in cities, like working as servers and everything, they lost their jobs. And so when they dropped out of the economy, median wages shoot up a ton. And then when they start coming back into the economy, you get like median wages falling again. But it's not really a bad thing. It was a good thing for them to turn back in. Is that when you say like the Phillips curve is breaking, are you referring to that? Or do you think there's a more real phenomenon that's like tracked per industry where it's not working anymore?
Mary Daly, the president of the San Francisco Fed, you know, gave a talk on this recently, and it was like, you know, it is coming back into realignment. For a while, you know, unemployment was remaining low and like wages were increasing, and like nobody really thought that could be the case. Like the labor market just was defying all odds across the board.
Wait, you said that unemployment was remaining low, but wages were increasing? Isn't that the expected thing, that as unemployment gets lower and lower, your supply of labor decreases, that the cost for labor would increase?
I'm not sure. Yeah, this is just what I.
Okay. Yeah.
So maybe I should read up. On
No,
it a
you're
little
fine.
bit
You're
more.
fine.
Yeah. But no, I mean, the main takeaway is that like the labor market has remained resilient in the face of like high inflation.
Yeah.
And that was sort of not what people expected it to be.
Right, because it's when
Yeah.
inflated, you would expect kind of everything to. It usually cools things off a lot,
Yeah.
but it didn't.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So the economy remained strong, and like so a lot of the models just didn't work anymore, and they've been going back into realignment, but it's been a long path. Yeah.
Was it COVID or what caused these models to fall out of to fall out of predictive power or whatever?
Yeah, the COVID. Yeah, the supply chain's breaking. Just sort of like, what does it look like to run a natural experiment where people lose their jobs and then they get stimulus checks and then you're locked inside and they're not spending money on services? And then what does it look like for them to reemerge into the world? You know, at first people were spending a lot of money on goods and now they're spending a lot of money on services and experiences. You know, a ton of Americans are flocking to Europe right now because the dollar is strong. And so it's some people have called it like the greatest natural economic experiment ever. Of course, it's in the face of great tragedy, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just a quick thing, another unfortunate thing about inflation is always measured in like a rate. Like we talk about inflation as a rate of things. So I think people have trouble conceptualizing when you start getting into derivatives, they have trouble conceptualizing a rate and they just see like an absolute value. So there's two issues. One is that if the rate of inflation decreases, nobody even cares because the absolute inflation, like the values are still higher, right?
Yeah.
If inflation goes to zero right now, that doesn't mean prices are falling. It just means they're not going up anymore. Yeah. And I think people in their head also have a really difficult time comparing potential increases and potential changes in the rate of change of an increase. So for instance, if you do a particular economic policy and prices continue to rise, they'll say your policy failed. It's like, well, no, the rise would have been 5%,
Sure.
but now it's only 2%.
Yeah.
But it's impossible, I think, for people to conceptualize that. Yeah. Or not impossible, but you have to like.
Well, it's tough. It's like it's very numeric, and I think that's kind of part of the issue too. Like with the communication thing that we were talking about, is if you tell people inflation is going down, they're like, well, things are still extremely expensive. Like, what do you mean? Mm-hmm. And of course, that's like not understanding that prices are just going up slowly. They're still going up. Yeah. And so like disinflation, deflation, like kind of delineating between those three things is important, but it takes a lot of space. And I think, too, like people want sort of immediate impact, like a lot of short-term gratification, right? Understandably so. Mm-hmm. And that is just not how economic policy works. Like even with the housing stuff, it's going to take forever to get out of this. And people are like, but, what about me?
So speaking of inflation and short-term gratification,